Not only does streaming like really incentivize music that scales, it also champions this like really placeless idea of music curation. The original idea for the platform had, much more to do with the advertising model than it did to do with music. Monthly active listeners or like stream counts like being so public, it has a negative impact on listeners and it also has a negative impact on artists.
I'm Audrey from Soft Center. I'm here with Liz Pelly, New York-based music journalist and author of the recent book Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. So you've just finished presenting a keynote at Soft Center Festival here in Sydney on Gadigal Country as part of the Discourse program, diving into your research on streaming surveillance. So resident advisor likes to start their exchanges with an open question. What's your first music memory?
That's a really impossible question for me. I'm not really sure what my first music memory is, but just in terms of thinking about like the time of life when music started to become really important to me, I'd say some of my more vivid memories are just, attending local all ages emo and pop punk shows, largely put on by teenagers for other teenagers. So it's an early music memory that sticks out for me.
I love that. I did actually want to ask you about your background in DIY spaces, which kind of got you into writing about music, right?
Sort of. I started writing about music when I was a teenager for the local alt weekly newspaper and the school newspaper. And it was actually a little bit after that. I feel like my background is firstly in journalism and then later on in college getting into like college radio and starting to book house shows that were sort of my introductions to DIY in a more meaningful way. But I do think that the perspective that informs Mood Machine is as much my background in journalism as my background involved in helping run community art spaces. I think being involved in underground music, you just meet a lot of musicians, and maybe that's sort of part of what informs the way in which musicians' voices are really centered in this book.
Totally. And you can see the difference between what it's like, the lived reality of hanging out in those music communities, to the reality of the streaming industry is a stark difference. So you've just published this book, Deconstructing the Whole Spotify Industrial Complex. Spotify, beginning in 2006, claimed to be a sort of solution to online music distribution. I really liked in your book that you kind of set up that context for what was the time that Spotify was built out of and who were the people who were building it, and this kind of like mid to late aughts and 2010s era of the proliferation of things like Pirate Bay and Napster. I was wondering if you think the seeds of the problems with Spotify today were part of it from the beginning and part of the culture at the time as well.
I think that when I think about sort of the problems with streaming, I think something that's important to remember is, you're never really fully talking about technological problems or problems that just specifically have to do with the technology itself, but there are problems of how music industry practices and politics and economics inform those technologies. So certainly I think it's really interesting to remember that specifically Spotify started as a company founded by advertising people, right? So the background of these people are in advertising, and the original idea for the platform had, much more to do with the advertising model than it did to do with music. It was an idea for a platform that would combine like a free streaming media library with ad revenue. And if you look at the early patents and listen to interviews with executives from the early years, it's pretty clear that what was being developed wasn't even necessarily music specific. And I think that kind of plays out. I'm not someone who thinks that universal access to music is the problem here. I think that there's other ways that we could imagine universal access to music that is not only like more fair to artists, but also it incorporates some sort of, yeah, like more responsible stewardship of musical archives. But I don't know if it's like the access to music itself that is the issue.
Totally. Nothing wrong with too much music.
I agree.
But yeah, you hinted at the end of your keynote today that you're interested in thinking about how libraries, public libraries, can play a role in this kind of archiving. Yeah, that's something you research into much, or?
Yeah, it's something that I've been interested in for a while now. So the section of my book that's about public libraries creating these kind of digital public spaces for local music, that part of the book was based on an article I had published a few years ago online. And when I was reporting that piece, I talked to so many people who told me about how when they were growing up, like going to the library and taking out a stack of CDs and bringing them home to listen to or like rip to their computer was a really important part of forming their, musical taste, but also just kind of like learning about music as part of like, their musical education growing up. And I think, yeah, like libraries have always sort of played a role in thinking about access to music, and they're one of the best resources that we have. And it would be really cool to see, yeah, musicians embrace that model a little bit more because I think, at least in my reporting, these tend to be programs that tend to grow from within inside the library, driven by the work of librarians. And I think that with all these types of resources, if communities don't engage with them, they don't like continue getting support. So if musicians think this is a cool idea, then actually tapping in and like participating and using these resources is going to be an important part of them continuing to exist.
I guess something I think about a lot with platforms like Spotify and big tech is them coming in and kind of producing this rhetoric of being democratizing forces and removing these gatekeepers, so removing the major labels. But I wouldn't really. The reality is that they've kind of become their own gatekeepers. It just looks completely different. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it is important to, yeah, remember that the streaming model as we know it, like, was sort of designed as a collaboration between, these streaming companies and the major record labels. And the major labels continue to have a lot of influence over the shape of streaming as it influences all artists. Like a really more recent example being a couple years ago when Spotify announced that like all tracks with 1,000 streams or less per year are going to be fully demonetized. That was part of, this broader batch of changes to the streaming model that was really championed by Universal Music Group as they were renegotiating their contracts with Spotify. And even if you like look every few years when, for example, Spotify and Universal like renew their license deals, they'll like put out a press release together like about their, new license negotiations, where they sort of like talk about the evolution of the streaming model as the result of their partnership. And that has consequences, like when you have a model that has so much influence over not just major label artists, but all artists, independent artists and DIY artists too, having to like, yeah, navigate these platforms that aren't built for them.
And how would you define independent artists or what it means to be independent? Because what I liked in your book is that you kind of really critique the individualism that I feel like platforms like Spotify really kind of amplify. Yeah, how would you define independence?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a shorthand that is overused, and we always can be well advised to try to like be more precise in what words we're actually trying to use. I guess like in that context, when I'm talking about independent music, basically like what I'm talking about is non-major label music. But I'm always really interested in, thinking about what actually are we talking about when we use the word
Yeah.
independent. And something that can be like really helpful is to, sort of like unpack it a little bit more. I think over the years it's become really clear, especially in the streaming context, that some of the impacts of streaming on music, like for example, the way in which the streaming model really incentivizes and rewards music that scales. So, like music that gets repeat listens. It kind of, in some ways, sort of clarifies that oftentimes when we talk about independent music, actually what we're talking about is like small scale cultural production and the way in which like historically independent labels have been really helpful in sometimes have been helpful in supporting music that operates on a smaller scale. And then also, I think sometimes the word independent gets used in place of talking about local music. So thinking about these other values like supporting local music, supporting smaller scale music, I think is also another way of kind of digging into some of the harms of streaming on culture because not only does streaming like really incentivize music that scales or reward music that scales, it also champions this like really placeless idea of music curation and this kind of like placelessness in music contextually. And I think that both of those things are
Do you
sort of
mean
worth fighting about.
by placelessness, yeah, that kind of vacuum of information, like these songs will disappear on a playlist and you don't really know anything about the artist or the label or anything? Is that what you mean by placelessness?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Like, I'm even thinking of like even the reality that not a lot of curation in the streaming ecosystem is like connected to a sense of like localism, even on like a city level or
Yeah,
something.
totally.
But then also that, I think the recontextualization of music according to just like vibes and like personalization
Yeah.
is so different than the question of like, I want to learn about music in the place where I live, you know?
Totally. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that. And like, what's with the aesthetics kind of branding of Spotify and all these vibes playlists? For example, you had in your book the playlist called Farmers Market and then subtitle POV Fresh Produce is in your reusable tote, the flowers are in bloom and you're sipping on an iced latte, or Sad Girl Shit brackets. I thought I was healed. Like you talk about all these kind of playlists and how they're super popular on Spotify. Where do you think this comes from and for what reason?
Yeah. So I think for a long time, I just kind of like assumed that really specific like niche playlist titles were a result of the sort of like curators or whoever's behind the curation ecosystem trying to just like guess things that people would be searching for. So it was almost like a SEO strategy or something. But I think with those types of playlists, it's become really clear that like what is being sold to the listener isn't even like an idea about music. It's, trying to sell you an idea of like who you are
Yourself, like main
or
character
yeah,
syndrome.
totally. It's like I think I refer to it as like aspirational aesthetics or something where it's just sort of like you're flicking through and you're not even thinking about like I want to listen to this music. You're thinking about like I want to be
Who
this
do I want to
person
be?
or
Yeah.
I want to feel this
Or
way
how do I want
today.
to be perceived?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it really like is really connected to, there's a lot of the book is about the idea of not just streaming, but like historically new music technologies being sold using like the promise of mood stabilization. And I think in some ways, I think these like really niche aspirational aesthetics are like sort of an outgrowth of that. I wouldn't say it's the same thing, but it seems sort of connected.
I find the kind of inwards looking rather than the kind of contextualization of what we were talking about really interesting, and also the lack of local context as well. I think that's really important to kind of think about and push back against. I like in your book you really emphasize that independent doesn't mean non-collaborative or community focused. It's more like independent from the major labels or commercialism. I guess with that, I'm very interested because I also work in publishing and you're a journalist, how this kind of corresponds, and we're talking part of Resident Advisor, which is a media platform, how this corresponds with the kind of decline of the music media ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, something that I think about a lot is how streaming was sort of pitched as something that wasn't just going to replace like the record store. Like it wasn't just pitched as a potential marketplace where artists could monetize their work, but also was kind of pitched as this replacement for radio also, and it, as like a a media product. So when thinking about alternatives to streaming, or not even like alternatives, but like how do you respond and move past it? I think it requires sort of thinking about not just ways of getting artists paid more fairly, championing buying music directly from artists when you can, participating in by going to shows and supporting independent music retail, but then also like thinking about it through a media lens. I think the grappling with the impacts of streaming on music like has a lot to do with remembering the importance of like supporting local media ecosystems and media co-ops and emerging like DIY media projects and things like that as well. I also think that a lot of what musicians have dealt with over the past 20 years, like an industry in flux due to the like impacts of corporate consolidation and shifts in the digital advertising landscape is really similar to what writers and journalists have had to contend with also. Journalism also has been subject to an immense amount of corporate consolidation, impact from the platform economy, and a lot of the things that musicians are exploring right now as like ways forward, like co-ops, for example, are also something that journalists and local media makers are exploring too, which I think is really interesting.
I saw recently in the news this week that Spotify announced it's bringing back its direct message function. Did you see this?
No.
Okay, well,
Breaking
we maybe need
news.
to fact check this, but I did see this. And I wonder if it comes at a time because, as we were talking about today, it's been very highlighted in the news. Daniel Ek, the CEO of Spotify's $700 million investment into the European defense company Helsing, which he also chairs, which develops drones and other military AI software. A lot of artists in the last couple of weeks alone, including Deerhoof, Su, King Lizard, and the Gizzard, Australian band, and even local acts playing soft centre like Bayang the Bushranger have announced that they're taking all their music off Spotify. So seeing in the news this week that they're bringing back messaging between users, I was wondering if you think maybe that it could be a way to kind of combat that bad press they've been getting recently.
It's hard for me to say if the two are connected in any way. Solidarity with all of those artists who have been removing their work and drawing attention to the connections between music and the military industrial complex. I think that that is like really powerful to see so many artists all in the same like short period of time moving
It
their
has
work,
been,
and I
yeah.
hope that like more organizing in that vein will continue to emerge. Yeah, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of the fact that Spotify brought back its direct messaging feature, and would be really curious to like read more about it in order to answer that question better.
Yeah, curious to see what happens. But that's kind of how I read it when I saw it in the news. I thought it might directly correlate. How do you see Spotify is shaping artists' self-image or idea of themselves. I think a lot about the one of the people the artist who you write about in your book, who was on Spotify for Artists, and he was really promoting it and saying, I've made all this money and I've gotten really successful through Spotify. And then a few years later, you check back on his Instagram and he's adding Spotify and saying that he's struggling. Yeah, I wonder what it was like talking to all these artists and seeing how they're feeling about the industry right now, or what it means to make music right now.
Yeah, I think that probably one of the things that like comes to mind when I think about like the way in which streaming has affected artists' self-image is or sense of like their own work is how harmful I think like all of the metrics that artists are confronted with on a daily basis can be to just like someone's sense of their own like value or sense of their own music, especially things like monthly active listeners or like stream counts, like being so public, not just like for yourself, but for like every single other artist. I think it has a negative impact on listeners and it also has a negative impact on artists as well. But yeah, I also think that, you know, the past several years, even artists like speaking up more or sharing more information about how meaningless these metrics are and how easily manipulated they are has, you know, maybe been like empowering or just sort of like helped people to sort of like make sense of how they're feeling about it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems very empowering to kind of make that step away, but also understand that not everyone would probably have the privilege to be able to do that.
Yeah. But just in terms of like how people are feeling, I mean, even just talking to independent artists, I think people are like really exhausted of having to figure out ways to navigate a really like complicated and exploitative media climate.
Really.
And are, you know, it seems like people are really excited about like moving away from streaming, like
Definitely.
embracing at times alternative platforms, at times just going back to physical media like MP3s, like, you know, more simple alternatives. But yeah, even in the conversations today, like I think something that I heard come up a few times is just like something that I think about a lot, just this importance of just really like rerouting locally in our local music scenes as like
Totally.
such a powerful antidote to all of the harmful and extractive impacts of not just streaming, but you know, corporate consolidation and
Definitely.
financialization and
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah. Support your local radio station,
Yes, yeah.
and local artists in general. Um, Yeah, I found that super interesting as well. In your book, you even mention how Justin Bieber at one point was asking his fans to keep his songs on repeat while they're sleeping just to get the streams
Is
up.
that in my book? I don't think
I'm
that's in
pretty,
my book.
yeah, I
It
think it
is?
is.
Really?
Yeah, maybe I just hallucinated
I'm
that.
gonna have to fact check that.
Or was it Taylor Swift?
I think so.
Maybe.
I don't
There
think
was definitely someone.
Really?
Or maybe I just read that elsewhere and conflated the two.
Maybe.
Just have Justin Bieber on my mind. But anyway, I was just thinking, well, if these artists have to do this, then what's an independent artist going to have to do?
Yeah.
Just appreciate the exposure.
Yeah.
Take what they can get. And then, not to mention the kind of ghost artists and fake artists that have been propping up on Spotify and fake streams as well. Did you find out much about that in your research?
Yes. Uh, yeah, actually, it ended up being a bigger part of the process of researching this book than I originally thought it was going to be. Um, but at the time I was working on the book, this had already been like a story for many years, and in some ways I kind of thought that the story was done or told.
Totally.
Starting as early as 2015, there were headlines in the music business press about how Spotify was supposedly filling popular playlists for sleeping and studying and focusing and chilling with music by artists who didn't exist, maybe fake artists. That was what they were called in the music business trade press and on social media. Like, yeah, for years, the public called them fake artists. And yeah, in the reporting process of the book, I learned that, there's actually like a sort of internal program at Spotify for how they think about this material. And I was able to even like talk to some musicians who had worked with production companies that are licensed under particular terms for the purposes of like filling out these playlists. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about it. I do think that when I was writing the book, I was careful to call them ghost artists, not fake artists, because I wanted to sort of make a distinction that the practice that I was reporting on like wasn't like a practice of filling playlists with music made using generative AI, but it was actually like these tracks by these musicians hired by these production companies, licensed under like terms that are like kind of unfavorable to the musicians, and favorable to the streaming companies. So I wanted to kind of make that distinction, but I do think there's a lot of implications for the, rise of generative AI music on streaming platforms. Tens of thousands of generative AI tracks are supposedly uploaded to streaming platforms every day. And when you already have like a curation ecosystem that is sort of like nudging people to not really think about like what artists are on their playlists or what artists are they listening to, and to just think about like moods and vibes and functional music and background playlists, like it makes it a lot easier for those listeners to be sort of like conditioned to just not think about whether or not the music they're listening to is made using Gen AI or by
Totally.
artists.
Yeah, and it just goes hand in hand with this kind of like cultural devaluation of art and music that we're seeing. But I guess on the flip side, I've been finding it really warming seeing a lot of peers and friends stepping away from Spotify and deleting it or deactivating their accounts. Like a lot of friends who I wouldn't have expected. It's just kind of been the final straw, the news with the investment in the defense company. So I found that really warming to see, seeing people just being active, and not kind of just leaning into the convenience economy. Everything's an economy if you put a word before it. So I think on that note, because the AI tracks are a whole big can of worms to get in, we could write a whole nother book about that one. So I think we'll wrap up with resident advisor's final question, which is, it's your last dance ever. What do you want to hear?
I want to hear the voices of my friends and loved ones singing a song to me.
Do you know what song that would be?
No, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, just their voices.
Yeah.
That's special. One for the library archive. Thank you so much for chatting with me, Liz.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, part of Soft Centre and resident advisor. It's been great having you here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your tour here.
Thank you so much.